In late November 1968, cold rain covered Willow Creek, while fog rolled down the mountains east of town. Inside the small sheriff's office, Sheriff Elias Mercer was finishing paperwork when the telephone rang at 10:40 p.m. The caller was Frank Delaney, a logging worker known for being difficult to frighten, but this time his voice was shaking. Delaney said that on an old logging road, he had just seen a woman nearly 6.5 feet tall, barefoot in the cold, her entire body covered in dark hair. In her arms she carried something wrapped like an infant. When Delaney lowered his truck window, the woman turned and clearly said, "Turn off the lights." Immediately afterward, branches began breaking deep in the woods, the sounds moving closer. Delaney abandoned his truck and ran almost a mile through the rain to reach a telephone. Mercer first assumed it was a mistake, a frightened man seeing something strange in bad weather, but the location held his attention. The road lay near Bluff Creek, an area already surrounded by Sasquatch stories. He immediately gathered Deputy Thomas Reed and Cal Warren, along with rain gear, flashlights, and a medical kit. Mercer continued telling himself they were probably going to find a woman in distress. None of the three knew that before the night ended, they would face something Mercer could never explain, and something that later seemed to vanish from every official record. They left Willow Creek in the department's largest patrol vehicle. Rain hammered the windshield, while both sides of the road became solid darkness. Nearly 20 minutes later, they found Delaney's truck sitting diagonally across the logging road, the driver's door open, headlights still on, keys in the ignition. Mercer checked the area and stopped when he saw a muddy handprint on the hood. It was almost 1.5 times wider than Warren's hand, with unusually long fingers. Before anyone could explain it, Reed called them to the roadside. In the flashlight beam was a line of enormous bare footprints pressed deep into the mud, each longer than any of their feet. The tracks were fresh. Mercer ordered Reed to follow slowly in the patrol vehicle while he and Warren walked beside the road. As the route narrowed, Mercer noticed something odd. Every few steps, the prints turned slightly toward the forest, as if whoever had made them had repeatedly looked back toward the men following. She was nearly 2 meters tall, bare feet sunk into mud, her body covered in soaked black-brown hair. Long hair from her head blended into the hair across her back. In her arms was a baby wrapped tightly in dark cloth, but the feature that sent a chill through Mercer was not her height or body hair, it was her face. Beneath the hair was clearly the face of a woman, deep eyes, a straight nose, high cheekbones, and features almost completely human. She looked at the patrol car, then slowly at each man. Mercer rested a hand near his holster, but did not draw his weapon. He introduced himself and asked whether she was injured or needed help. She did not answer. Instead, she tightened her arms around the child and watched Mercer as though waiting for him to say something more important. The woman understood every word. When Mercer asked her to let Reed examine the baby, she immediately pulled the blanket closer and stepped backward. Mercer drew his pistol but kept the barrel low. Her eyes moved to the gun and then toward the trees. In a rough but unmistakably clear voice, she said, "They're coming." Warren immediately swept his flashlight through the forest. One pair of reflected eyes appeared high between the trunks. Then a second pair, then a third. A low growl rolled across the woods, deep enough to vibrate faintly through their chests. The woman crouched at once, turned her back toward the sound, and wrapped her entire body around the child. Mercer realized she was not preparing to attack the officers. She was shielding the infant from whatever was moving through the forest. A young tree suddenly shook violently and fell into the brush. Reed backed toward the vehicle and said they needed to leave immediately. Mercer made a decision. They would take the woman and the child back to the sheriff's office. She agreed, but before entering the vehicle, she looked directly at Mercer and warned him, "Take us into town, and the hunters will know where we are." At the station, Mercer quietly placed her in cell 2 and wrote in the duty log, Female, unidentified, protective custody pending medical evaluation. Standard handcuffs would not fit around her wrists, so they did not attempt to restrain her. She sat on the floor with the infant in her arms and watched everything through the bars. About half an hour later, the baby woke and cried. Reed brought milk and a bottle downstairs. The woman accepted them, tested the temperature against the inside of her wrist, and carefully fed the child. Her hands were enormous, with long fingers and thick nails, yet she supported the infant's head with astonishing gentleness. Reed stood outside the cell, watching in silence. At that moment, he began to understand that the most unsettling thing was not that the woman looked like a creature from local legend. It was that she cared for the baby exactly like a mother. Mercer pulled a chair to the cell and repeatedly asked her name, where she lived, and where the child had come from. She refused to answer. From time to time she looked toward the ceiling, as if listening to a sound none of the officers could hear. Finally, she placed the child beside her and scratched a symbol into the concrete floor with one thick nail. It consisted of 3 connected lines and a curved mark. Warren suggested it might be some kind of writing. Several minutes later, she suddenly said, "Don't use the radio." Almost immediately, the radio at the end of the hallway burst into sustained static mixed with sounds that seemed strangely like distant voices. When the signal returned, the woman looked at Mercer. "They can hear it." She called the people chasing her the hunters. Warren wanted to contact county authorities, but Mercer refused. They did not know who the hunters were, and bringing more people into the situation could make it worse. Near 2 in the morning, Reed stepped outside the rear door for a cigarette. Looking down at the wet ground beneath the cell window, he froze. An enormous footprint had just been pressed into the mud. Its edges remained sharp despite the continuing rain. Inside the building, the woman still sat with the sleeping baby in her arms. Reed shone his flashlight toward the forest and saw a branch almost 10 feet above the ground slowly moving. The following morning, Dr. Samuel Harker arrived. At first he considered familiar explanations: hypertrichosis, hormonal disorders, skeletal deformity. But the longer he examined the woman, the less comfortable those explanations became. Her resting heart rate was unusually slow. Her proportions differed from ordinary human anatomy in several consistent ways. Her hands were extremely large with long fingers, yet their fine motor control was precise. What Harker found hardest to explain was the scene directly in front of him. The woman carefully picked a loose thread from the baby's blanket, using fingertips that looked powerful enough to crush it. She behaved like a mother. Harker asked whether she understood English. Yes. He then asked whether she was human. The woman looked at Harker and said, "I was born human." She gave her name as Mara Voss. Mara said her mother was Helen Voss, a woman who had lived in the mountains many years earlier. Helen had been badly injured in an avalanche and was saved by the people in the forest. Mercer asked which people. Mara looked toward the small window and said humans had given them too many wrong names. Harker wanted to take Mara to a hospital for proper tests. The moment she heard the word hospital, she pulled the infant closer. She said that if they went there, they will see it. Mercer asked what she meant. Mara answered simply, "It's a child." The answer sounded obvious, but the way she said it made Mercer and Harker realize the deeper issue had not yet been reached. Harker examined the infant at the station. It looked like an ordinary human newborn in size, skin, facial structure, and reflexes. That only made the situation more confusing. Mercer asked whether Mara was the biological mother. Mara said that several days earlier she had heard many gunshots in the deep forest. When she reached the area, a shelter had been destroyed. The people protecting the child were gone or dead. She found the baby hidden inside a hollow beneath a large tree, wrapped in cloth and nearly exhausted from the cold. Mercer asked who the parents were. Mara watched him for a long time and said that if she answered, he would immediately ask a question whose answer he was not ready to hear. Harker asked whether the child was connected to the creatures local people called Sasquatch. Mara did not directly confirm it. It belongs to both sides. The words made the room feel heavier. Mercer realized that since the moment they found her, Mara had never truly tried to convince them she was human. Her attention had always returned to one thing: keeping the infant alive. That afternoon, Warren looked outside and saw a black sedan parked across the street. A man sat behind the wheel but did not get out. Warren crossed the road to ask what he wanted. The sedan immediately drove away. Warren managed to notice that it had no rear license plate. When Mercer heard about the vehicle, he returned to the duty book. The line identifying the unknown woman was still there. He studied it for several seconds, then took a small piece of paper and wrote Mara Voss, the date, and the time she had entered the station. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. He did it almost instinctively, as though part of him had already begun to suspect that the official record might not remain as permanent as he once believed. Night came early. The rain weakened, but wind carried mountain cold through gaps around the station. Mercer stayed with Reed and Warren. Harker returned to his clinic, promising to come back the next morning. Mara sat inside cell 2 with the infant asleep. At 11:17 p.m., every light in the building went out at once. The radio died. The telephone line went silent. Mercer stood immediately and heard metal strike hard somewhere behind the cell block. He took a flashlight and ran down the hall with Reed. They reached cell 2 in less than a minute. The cell door was still locked. Mara was gone. The baby was gone too. Mercer unlocked the door and searched the room. The small rear window had not changed. The opening was so narrow an average man would struggle to fit through, making it impossible to imagine Mara squeezing through. Reed found water on the floor. A line of wet footprints began near the back wall and led toward the cell door, even though the door had remained locked. Mercer crouched beside the symbol Mara had scratched into the concrete. The 3 lines and curve remained, but now another mark had been added, extending from the original symbol like an arrow. She left footprints. She left the symbol. She left him a direction. Mara Voss wanted Sheriff Elias Mercer to follow her into the woods. Mercer remained in cell 2 for several seconds, looking down at the new line while Reed examined the wet prints, and Warren stood outside the hallway with his flashlight toward the rear door. The small window showed no fresh damage. Its metal frame was intact, and the old paint around it had not been disturbed. Mercer kept returning to the same question. If Mara wanted to escape, why leave a trail? He told Warren to remain at the station, monitor the telephone, and contact them if power returned. Warren objected, but Mercer needed someone who knew what had happened inside the building if Mercer and Reed did not come back by morning. Reed took a rifle from the lockup and extra flashlight batteries, then followed Mercer into the cold drizzle. Mara's footprints were so clear in the soft ground behind the station that they barely needed to search. The 2 men followed the trail through the rear lot and onto a narrow forest path. Mercer noticed that Mara could easily have stepped onto leaves, roots, and rock where tracks would be difficult to follow. Instead, she repeatedly chose mud, leaving deep, clear prints. Every few hundred yards, Reed found the same symbol from cell 2 cut into tree bark. Some marks were so fresh that sap still bled from them. At one tree, Reed stopped, held his fingers near the cuts, and looked at Mercer. People running away usually hide where they went. Mercer had already reached the same conclusion. They were following a woman who had somehow vanished from a locked cell, but the farther they moved into the woods, the more Mercer felt that they were not tracking her at all. The trail divided into 3 branches in low ground near a small creek. Mercer shone his light downward and found 3 different track patterns. On the left were Mara's footprints. The center trail held prints much larger than hers, with broad heels and long toes, so deep that rainwater had collected in them. The right branch held human boot prints. Reed crouched and studied the boots. They did not look like ordinary work boots used by loggers in the area. The tread was deep and closer to military footwear. Reed wanted to return and call for more officers. After the black sedan, the radio warning, and the power failure at exactly the right time, he no longer wanted to broadcast their location to anyone who might be listening. They followed Mara's tracks. Her stride showed she had been moving much faster than when they first found her, but the spacing remained controlled rather than panicked. After a while, a faint infant cry came from ahead. Reed stopped. Mercer recognized a gunshot before the echo fully disappeared. He and Reed ran down a steep route toward a rock cut. Low branches whipped against their coats and mud pulled at their boots. This time Mercer was not thinking about returning Mara to custody. They found Mara outside a rock shelter, almost hidden by ferns and fallen timber. She stood in shadow with the baby against her chest, face tense. When she saw Mercer, she raised one hand, palm outward, telling him to stop. Reed lowered his flashlight and stared at the ground. Dozens of enormous footprints covered the earth in front of the cave. Some were near Mara's size. Mercer slowed. Standing in a place used by so many large creatures made him more cautious than any pursuit he remembered. For several moments, the forest became strangely quiet again. Water dripped from the rock overhang. Reed's breathing sounded heavy behind him. Mara turned and entered the cave. She did not clearly signal them to follow, but the way she moved gave Mercer the unmistakable feeling that they should. Reed kept the rifle low. Mercer saw the first body near the left wall and stopped. Reed immediately raised the rifle toward Mara and asked whether the creatures outside had killed them. Mara looked at him, walked to the nearest skeleton, picked up a rusted metal tag, and gave it to Mercer. It was an old identification tag bearing the name of a man Mercer did not know. Mara said the dead men had entered the forest to hunt. The way she emphasized the word made Mercer understand they were not hunting deer or bear. Some had died in accidents. There were deaths Mara had not witnessed, and she refused to claim knowledge she did not have. Reed pointed to one skeleton whose leg had once been splinted with medical equipment and asked why the bodies had been kept in the cave. Mara said the forest people brought some of the dead here because they wanted to know who had come. The answer was strange enough to make Reed quiet. Mercer continued searching the chamber and found a metal box behind a low rock. Its lid was rusted, but intact inside were restraints, glass tubes, old syringes, tranquilizer rounds, and numbered metal tags. Reed held one tag under the flashlight, Specimen 4, male. Under it was the year 1959. Mercer checked the other tags. Some had no writing left. Some held only numbers. Mara reached into a crack in the rock and removed a faded Polaroid. The photograph showed an enormous foot beside a measuring ruler. Behind it stood a man in a white shirt, his face turned partly toward the camera. Mercer recognized him after several seconds. He turned the photograph over. Vossline confirmed. Mercer looked at Mara. What does Vossline mean? Mara hesitated, as if deciding how much truth the two men could absorb. Then she sat on a stone, held the baby close, and began telling them about Helen Voss. Helen had lived in the mountains when she was young. According to Mara, in the late 1930s she became trapped during an avalanche, badly injured, with most of her supplies lost. She could not return on her own. Creatures living deep in the forest found her. They brought food, protected her from weather, and kept her alive through the winter. Eventually, Helen returned to human society for a time. She worked, bought supplies, and spoke with people in town, but slowly withdrew. Later, she disappeared into the mountains again. Mara was born after that. Mercer asked who Mara's father was. Mara answered with a short, low vocal sound, unlike any English name Mercer had ever heard. Reed looked at him. Mara said she grew up among several shelters. Helen taught her simple reading, road signs, how to use a knife, needle, thread, and some human tools. She also taught her that people outside the forest lived by laws, money, records, and very different ways of dividing the world. Eventually, Helen believed someone in the outside world could help the forest communities remain undisturbed. She went to meet that person. Mara searched for years and eventually came to believe her mother had been captured. Mercer asked whether the man in the Polaroid was involved. Mara looked at the photograph and said she had seen his face among objects recovered from hunter camps. Mercer still tried to think like a sheriff. He told Mara that even a detailed story was not proof by itself. She reminded him of the footprint outside the cell window. "Do you really believe someone from your town made that?" She looked toward the cave entrance. The reaction was immediate. She crossed the chamber, grabbed Mercer by the coat, and pulled him down. A fraction of a second later, bark exploded from the tree trunk behind the spot where he had been standing. Reed spun toward the forest. Only water and leaves moved outside. The gunshot had been so muted they understood it only after seeing the impact. Mercer touched the fresh hole and realized the shooter either had a suppressor or was far enough away for the woods to swallow most of the report. Reed signaled that they needed to leave. Mara stepped outside, faced a distant slope, and released a sequence of low calls separated into short rhythms. Mercer had heard howling the previous night, but this sounded more like a signal. Several seconds later, a reply came from far away. Mara said they needed to separate. Mercer wanted to take her somewhere safe, but she told him no human place was safe once the hunters knew she had entered Willow Creek. She gave him the Polaroid and one of the metal tags. On the back of the photograph, the man's name was clearer: Edwin Vale. Mara then carried the baby into a narrow stone passage and moved so quickly that within minutes, Mercer's flashlight could no longer reach her. Mercer and Reed returned to town near dawn. Warren told them that while they were gone, 2 unknown men had visited the station. They wore ordinary clothing, spoke politely, and asked whether the department had taken custody of a dangerous animal from the forest. Warren asked which agency they represented. They avoided the question. When he refused to let them inside, they left in a dark vehicle. Mercer placed the Polaroid on his desk, opened old files, and began searching for Edwin Vale. The search took most of the morning. Vale appeared occasionally in land, forestry, and wildlife survey records dating from the late 1950s. His job title changed from document to document, but the most common description was simply Federal Field Liaison. No specific agency was named. Mercer found an old file referencing a program called the Palisade Survey, associated with forest areas, under restricted access. Several pages had been cleanly cut from the binder. The remaining page numbers skipped in obvious gaps, proof that material had been removed from the official file. Reed found a 1961 missing person report involving a hunter. In the lower corner, someone had drawn, in pencil, the same 3 connected lines and curved mark Mara scratched into cell 2. Mercer recognized it instantly. The report was 7 years old. Until then, Mercer could still believe the symbol belonged only to Mara. Now he knew it had existed in Willow Creek's own records years before he met her. Harker returned early that afternoon, carrying an empty envelope. He said he had collected several hairs from the blanket Mara used. Under his microscope, the structure confused him. Some features resembled human hair, while the medulla and thickness differed from any sample he regularly saw. His clinic lacked the equipment for deeper analysis, so he planned to send the material to a larger laboratory. Before he could, a man visited the clinic, claimed to represent a federal medical office, and demanded the samples as part of a biological hazard investigation. Harker refused because the man had no proper paperwork. By morning, the samples were gone from a locked drawer. Mercer asked whether the clinic had been broken into. Harker said the lock was intact. The answer reminded Mercer of Cell 2 in a way he did not like. Reed suggested contacting the county office directly and reporting federal impersonation. Mercer looked at the missing pages, stolen samples, and Polaroid from 1959. Then he asked a question he would once have considered paranoid. What if the people above us are the people sending them? Before Reed could answer, the telephone rang. A calm male voice introduced himself as Edwin Vale. Mercer asked what he meant. Vale never used Mara's name. He referred only to a subject that could present a public health risk and said his team would be arriving in Willow Creek to assume control. Mercer lowered the receiver and stared at the old photograph. The face in it was younger, but the name Edwin Vale had just become a living man. Vale shook Mercer's hand as though they were meeting about an ordinary administrative issue. He produced a packet authorizing the recovery of an unidentified animal presenting a public health risk. Why doesn't this mention a woman? If Mara was recognized as a human being, she would have rights, arrest procedures, lawyers, and records. Mercer said Mara had left custody before identification was completed. Vale asked for the booking record. Mercer said it had not been finalized. That may be best for everyone involved. Mercer asked directly about the infant. He did not ask whether the baby was male or female. He asked only one question. Is it alive? Vale already knew about the child, and the child's survival mattered to him more than anything involving the woman who had entered the station. We don't intend to hunt in town. The wording made Reed, standing near the doorway, glance toward Mercer. As Vale's group prepared to leave, Reed walked around one of the vehicles under the excuse of checking registration. A rear door had not closed fully. Through the gap he saw a collapsible steel cage large enough to contain something over 7 feet tall. When Reed reported what he saw, Mercer's remaining hesitation disappeared. They had arrived with equipment designed to capture something Mara's size or larger. He told Vale that the tracks probably led south toward an old logging route. After Vale's vehicles left town in that direction, Mercer prepared to go north with Reed and Warren, where Mara's actual symbols had appeared. He opened the patrol car and stopped. The familiar 3-line symbol had been carved into the front. Beneath it, one English word was scratched awkwardly but clearly. Trust, Reed. Reed had worked beside him for years. He had stood with Mercer through the worst nights of police work. Now Mara had left a message. Mercer did not know how to read. Trust Reed or beware of Reed. He kept the bark in his palm longer than necessary. The word Reed had been carved so deeply that small wood fibers still stood along the cuts. Mercer watched his deputy beside Warren, looking for some change in posture or behavior that could explain the message. Reed looked exactly like the man Mercer had known for almost 6 years. The deputy who once entered floodwater to pull a child from a trapped car, and who had sat beside Mercer through an entire night after a logging accident killed 2 men. Mercer slipped the bark into his coat and said only that they were going north. Reed looked at him slightly longer than usual because Mercer's false information to Vale pointed south. Mercer explained that he wanted to check another route before Vale's convoy returned. The answer satisfied Warren. Reed only nodded. Mercer kept Reed within sight and occasionally slowed to observe him. Reed behaved normally. He checked tracks carefully, warned Warren not to step on soft ground, pointed out broken branches, and discussed terrain with Mercer. The longer Mercer watched him, the more tiring it became to doubt someone familiar. He did not want the message to carry its worst possible meaning, but Mara would not have written Reed's name for no reason. Reed opened his bag for water and accidentally dropped a folded piece of paper. He bent quickly, but Mercer had already seen it. "What's that?" "Just a note. Let me see it." Finally, Reed handed it over. The page held a telephone number in Eureka and a short instruction to report any unusual biological events occurring around Willow Creek. Mercer asked when Reed received it. Reed looked toward the creek and admitted that more than a year earlier, after a report of strange footprints, a man claiming to work for the federal government contacted him. The man said the government was gathering information about large wildlife for public safety and asked Reed to call whenever something unusual happened. Not enough to make Reed think of himself as an informant. Mercer asked the question that mattered. "Did you call this number the night Delaney reported the woman?" Reed did not answer immediately. Finally, he said he had called from another telephone shortly after Mara was brought into the station. The case seemed unusual enough that he thought the federal contact should know. When Vale appeared, Reed began to understand that the program was not what he had been told. Mercer turned away several steps. After that call came the black sedan, the stolen hair sample, the unknown men asking about Mara, and Vale's convoy with a steel cage. Reed had opened the door. Reed did not protect himself with excuses. "I was wrong," he said. An apology changed nothing. He asked whether Reed had reported their current position or plan. Reed said that once he understood what Vale's people wanted, he stopped communicating with them. Mercer folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. He still did not show Reed the bark with trust on one side. Maybe Mara had not been warning Mercer away from Reed. Maybe she wanted him to know that Reed was the weakness Vale's people had already used, and that understanding this weakness was necessary if they expected to survive. Warren, checking the ground behind them, called both men over. A line of enormous tracks moved through the mud parallel to the route they had taken. They were larger than Mara's footprints, with broad heels and a length far beyond any man's foot. Reed reached toward his weapon. Mercer told him not to draw. It was the small blanket that had once wrapped the infant, the same worn thread Reed remembered from feeding the child at the station. The creature had moved backward and reappeared farther away, almost as if indicating a direction. Mercer decided to follow. They saw Mara first. She stood on raised ground roughly 30 yards away, the child now wrapped in dryer cloth. Mara looked at Mercer, then at Reed. The first stood behind a large trunk and was almost a head taller than she was. Dark brown hair covered broad shoulders. The arms extended near the knees. Some stood almost fully upright. Others leaned forward slightly. Warren slowed his breathing. Reed stood rigid and silent. Bigfoot was no longer a footprint, a howl, or a shape glimpsed in darkness. One older creature had silver hair running from the temples down the shoulders. In a low but clear voice, she explained that the marks on trees were boundaries and signals. Forest groups used them to identify human areas, dangerous places, and safe travel routes. Some symbols Mara had adapted so Mercer could understand them. She also explained that disappearances around the region over many years did not have one cause. Some people died in accidents. Some entered hidden hunter camps and never returned. She wanted Mercer to understand that the truth was more complicated than either human legends or hunter stories. Mercer asked about individuals who had been captured. Mara said Vale's group and people before him had taken at least 3 alive that she knew about. One was released months later. It came back with scars around both wrists, several teeth missing, and a violent fear of metallic sounds. He asked why the creatures had remained still the night Mercer found Mara on the road. There had been at least 3 around them. They could easily have overwhelmed 3 officers. Mara said the howls that night were a question. She answered that she did not. She wanted to see what Mercer would do when forced to deal with someone who looked human enough to deserve protection, but strange enough to fall outside every familiar rule. Mercer looked at her differently. "Why? I needed someone with the authority to put my name into a record." Mercer signaled him to remain calm. Mara took it and handed it to Mercer. It was a mud-covered brass badge, the kind clipped to clothing or equipment. "The hunters are in the area," Mara said. "They're closer than you think. Everyone left the valley by another route." Mara led them to a deeper shelter with dry rock hollows, logs arranged as wind barriers, and human items stored inside wooden boxes. There Mercer finally asked the question that had followed him since the first night. Who was the child? Mara sat beside a stone wall and looked down at the sleeping infant. For generations, she explained, there had been people who lived near the boundary between the 2 communities. Some human families stayed close enough to Sasquatch groups to learn signals, exchange food, and protect one another's locations. Children were born. Mara came from one of those lines. She avoided scientific language she did not know, and Mercer gradually understood that this was not a story that could be reduced to one easy word like hybrid. The infant belonged to a family within that network. Right now the child looked completely human. That was what made it dangerous. A child with records, family history, and biological samples could become a verifiable bridge between two worlds. Mercer asked why Mara did not seek the child's human relatives. They had already been watched, she said. A shelter had been attacked. The baby was hidden and left behind. Mara carried it away because she knew the next places the hunters would search were families living closer to towns. Reed listened with a heavier expression. He understood that his telephone call might have helped Vale learn the infant was still alive. Inside were old papers, photographs, and a birth certificate. Helen Voss appeared on several documents. One photograph showed Helen young, standing outside a wooden house. She had Mara's eyes and cheekbones. Another photograph held Mercer's attention longer. Mara said it was one of very few photographs her mother kept. Mercer felt decades of Bigfoot stories reorganizing themselves into something much more uncomfortable. If these documents were authentic, the hidden story predated his career, Reed's confidential reporting arrangement, and even the well-known regional sightings. Warren found it when he lifted the wooden lining. 7 names were written on it. Helen Voss was first. Mara Voss came next. Second generation, viable. Reed read the phrase slowly. The name there was Elias Mercer. Warren saw it too. Reed stared at Mercer and asked why a program tracking the Voss family would include the sheriff. Mara said she would explain later. Vale's people were too close. Harker could keep medical notes. Mercer had the authority to create official reports. If they got Mara and the baby to a lawyer in Eureka, they could make enough copies of the documents that Vale would no longer be able to remove everything. Reed agreed. They prepared a civilian vehicle belonging to Harker to avoid attention. Mara and the baby would hide beneath blankets and boxes in the rear. Warren would use the patrol car on a different route if Vale's convoy appeared. Mercer and Reed would travel with Mara. Forest slowly gave way to wider road. If they reached a more populated area, Vale would have less freedom to act. Mara looked at the baby. She did not want a house in town. She wanted the child to grow up without learning to hide every time it heard an engine or gunshot. To her, she was protecting a child's chance at a different life. A truck blocked the road around the next bend. Mercer slowed immediately. Vale asked Mercer to surrender the infant. Mercer asked what law authorized the seizure of a newborn. Instead, he offered terms. Give up the baby. Mara would be allowed to leave. There was no humor in the sound. You gave Helen Voss the same promise. Mercer asked whether Vale knew Helen. Vale admitted that he did. Years earlier, Helen had voluntarily cooperated with a research project because she believed proving the forest communities were organized and intelligent would lead to protection. Wealthy people learned what biological samples, skeletons, and living specimens might be worth. Private research money entered. Mercer asked what happened to Helen. Vale said she trusted the wrong people. 3 answering knocks came from farther away. Mara looked at Vale. They've seen you. Today you made Willow Creek part of the problem. Mercer knew it was not victory. They returned to deeper forest instead of continuing to Eureka. At an isolated house belonging to Harker, Mercer put the list of 7 names on the table and demanded an explanation. Why was Elias Mercer on it? Mara asked whether he remembered 1964, when 2 hunters disappeared north of town. Mara said that decision unknowingly blocked one of Vale's hunting teams from reaching a shelter containing several injured forest individuals. The forest people remembered Mercer's patrol vehicle, his scent, and the way he stood in the road and refused to let the survey group continue. They did not understand human law. Was the first night on the logging road really an accident? She knew his patrol habits. She knew Delaney used that road. Anger replaced confusion. Every choice since that first night seemed partly manipulated. Mara admitted it. If she appeared in the forest and ran, he might bring a full search team. But if Mercer personally took her into custody, his own rules required him to identify her, provide shelter, call a doctor, and create a record. Mara had gambled on his principles. "Why did you trust a man who didn't believe in Bigfoot?" "I never needed you to believe in Bigfoot," she said. "I needed you to believe that a person holding a baby should be treated like a person until you had evidence otherwise." Late that afternoon, Harker returned to the sheriff's office to recover records and make copies. Mercer remained with Mara, Reed, and Warren. They waited nearly an hour before the telephone rang. Harker's voice was lower than normal. "Something's wrong." "What?" "The duty log is gone." Mercer asked him to explain. Every entry from the night Mara entered cell 2 had disappeared from storage. The medical evaluation sheet was gone. Several photographs Warren had taken were missing from their envelope. Harker added one sentence. "Elias, somebody has started erasing the case." Mercer kept the telephone against his ear for several seconds. Mara sat in the next room beside the child. Reed and Warren watched him. At that moment, Mercer understood something more frightening than Vale knowing where Mara was. These people were no longer simply trying to capture a woman. They were preparing to make the world believe that she had never existed. Mercer drove back to Willow Creek with Reed and Warren immediately after the call. He moved faster than usual but kept the vehicle controlled on the wet road. Reed occasionally looked toward him and then back through the windshield. Warren, in the rear seat, understood that files had been taken but did not yet understand the deeper meaning. To Mercer, it was something else. A person could disappear. A photograph could be stolen. A doctor could be threatened into silence. Mercer had worked long enough to know that records were what remained when witnesses were doubted. The station was lit when they arrived. Mercer went directly to the records cabinet. The entire relevant duty book section had been removed. The envelope that once held Warren's photographs remained in place, but only blank paper was inside. Harker's preliminary sheet referring to a female detainee had disappeared. Mercer went downstairs to cell 2. The concrete where Mara had scratched her symbol had been ground down. Someone had used a tool on the surface, leaving the floor slightly brighter than the surrounding area. Deep portions of the scratches still created faint shadows when light struck from the side, but anyone who did not know what to look for would see meaningless marks. Warren admitted that earlier in the afternoon, 2 men arrived with administrative inspection paperwork. They claimed to represent the county and said they needed to examine records after the power failure. The documents looked legitimate. One man had identification. Warren let them inside. They stayed about 20 minutes. Mercer called the county office while Warren stood beside him. No inspection team had been sent to Willow Creek. Warren went pale. "I opened the door for them." Mercer understood the feeling. Reed had opened another door through a telephone call. People like Vale did not always need to break locks. They needed only the correct document, voice, and assumptions of people trained to cooperate with authority. Mercer told Warren not to waste time blaming himself. They needed to find whatever had not been taken. Reed checked evidence storage. Mercer searched his desk. After nearly half an hour, they had almost nothing. The bark with "Trust in Reed" remained in Mercer's coat. So did the small note on which he had written Mara Voss and the time she entered custody. What once looked like unimportant scraps had become the only personal records directly linking Mara to the station. Mercer called Harker again. He and Reed drove to the clinic. The front door was unlocked. Papers had been disturbed but not violently destroyed. Harker had hidden a copy of his notes inside a large orthopedic trauma textbook and had told Mercer where. The book remained on the shelf. The pages between it were empty. Reed walked around the room. Harker's glasses lay beside it. His car was still outside. Mercer called through the clinic. Reed opened the rear door. 2 sets of male boot prints led into an alley. The other had deep military-style tread. Harker's tracks were impossible to separate because the ground near the door had been heavily disturbed, but a long smear in the mud suggested he may have been dragged or moved without walking normally. Mercer reached for the radio to issue a missing person alert. If Vail monitored local channels, broadcasting Harker's disappearance would tell them immediately that Mercer was still resisting. Reed suggested using trusted locals. Mercer knew the more people they involved, the greater the chance that information would leak through someone else like Reed had once leaked it. They returned to Mara. She knew Harker was missing as soon as she saw Mercer's face. He described the clinic, the boot tracks, and the doctor's car. Mara stood still. What does Harker usually smell like? Mercer did not understand. Reed said the doctor almost always smelled faintly of antiseptic, medicine, and cigarette smoke. Mara nodded. Take me there. Bringing Mara back into town contradicted everything they were trying to do, but they had no other lead. After dark, he brought her through the clinic's rear entrance. Mara moved room to room, lowered her face near Harker's coat, then went into the alley. She followed the trail in a way completely different from Mercer or Reed. She stopped where no visible footprints remained, touched low branches, smelled places where bark had been rubbed, and continued. Mercer realized he was depending on an ability he would have dismissed as impossible only days earlier. The camp had once stored equipment before logging operations shifted elsewhere. Several buildings remained, roofs rusted, doors warped. Mercer signaled Reed to circle left. Mara moved with Mercer along stacked old timber. Vail's voice was clearest. He spoke to Harker with almost patient calm. All the doctor needed to do, Vail said, was sign one statement. The officers had misunderstood her condition because they lacked medical training. There were no unusual biological samples. There was no infant connected to anything extraordinary. Harker refused. Vail said one signature could protect Harker's reputation, medical license, and perhaps people in town. Harker still refused. Harker was tied to a chair. Two men stood near the door. Vail sat opposite him, beside a stack of papers and a large map. Mercer whispered that their first objective was to get Harker out. Mara pointed toward the back, where several boards were missing from a small window. Reed appeared on the opposite side and signaled that he was ready. Mercer would draw attention at the front entrance. Reed would enter from the side. Mara would use the rear opening to cut Harker's restraints if she could. Warren, who had secretly followed after realizing the others left the station, stepped on a loose sheet of metal. The sound rang across the camp. One of Vail's men opened the door. Mercer stepped into view before the man could alert the others. He aimed his weapon and ordered everyone to stay still. Vail rose slowly, looking disappointed rather than surprised. Reed entered from the left. Mara pushed through the rear opening and cut Harker's restraints with a small knife. Warren fired a warning shot into wood beside the doorway. The situation tightened instantly. Mercer warned that anyone who shot a local police officer would create an investigation. Even Vail might have trouble erasing. Vail looked around, understood that the balance had shifted, and ordered his men to lower their hands. Harker was brought outside. Mercer did not attempt to arrest Vail. He lacked enough officers to hold the entire group safely, and he knew every document Vail carried could be transformed into a different official story once higher authorities became involved. He took only the statement Harker had been pressured to sign and the map from the table. Outside, Mercer opened the map under vehicle lights. Some read collection point, others read family site. Dates extended from the late 1950s to the present. The locations were not random. They formed a network following valleys, water sources, and travel routes through the forest. Mara leaned closer. A new mark appeared in the north. It covered the exact region where her community planned to move the infant. Vail already knew about it. Mercer understood the problem immediately. If Mara returned to the community, the hunters might follow. If she returned to town, records would disappear and the baby would become easier to seize. They returned to the temporary house. Harker was examined and said he was well enough to move. Reed spread the map across the table. Warren watched the window. Mara sat beside the baby with one hand on the blanket. Mercer proposed using Vale's own information network against him. Reed still had the telephone number used to report unusual events. He would call and report fresh signs of Mara heading toward a southern ravine. Warren would drive the patrol car south and make sure he was seen. Mercer and Mara would go north and then change route, creating enough distance for the forest community to move. Harker would take the infant to a third temporary shelter separate from both routes. At the suggestion of separating from the baby, Mara held Mercer's gaze for a long time. For the first time, her resistance contained no argument or warning. She simply pulled the child closer. If Vale's people always tracked Mara, he explained, carrying the child made them one target. Harker had already proven that he would accept personal danger rather than sign a lie. If there was one human outside the forest Mara could trust with the infant for several hours, it was the doctor. Harker did not try to persuade her. He let Mara decide. After a long silence, she placed the baby in his arms. She adjusted the blanket around its head, touched one finger gently to its cheek, and gave Harker a warning. If the forest people come, don't run, stand still. Let them see your face and hands first. Harker nodded. The trust felt heavier to Mercer than any promise. Only days earlier, Mara had begged him not to take the child into town because she believed people would kill it. Now she entrusted that same child to a human because of the choices Mercer and Harker had made. The plan began before dawn. Reed called the old number and reported Mara's tracks heading south. He kept his voice close to how he used to make reports. The person on the other end asked only a few questions and hung up. Warren drove the patrol car down an old logging route and deliberately stopped at places where observers could easily see him. Harker carried the child on a side road toward an isolated cabin owned by one of Mercer's trusted acquaintances. From high ground, Mercer saw two dark vehicles drive south. Reed rejoined them and said Vale's people had taken the bait. Then Reed reviewed the vehicles he had seen and noticed something. Vale was not in either one. Cold moved down his spine before he could put the thought into words. Vale had sent part of his team after the false information. Reed looked down at the personal radio on his belt. It was the same device he had used during earlier contacts. He suddenly remembered that one of the men from Eureka once told him always to carry that particular radio during field checks because they could synchronize the signal. At the time, Reed thought nothing of it. Now he removed the rear cover. A small component was fixed inside that he had never noticed before. Reed did not know exactly what it did. They had been carrying something that might allow others to determine direction or position throughout the entire search. Reed smashed the radio against stones and crushed it beneath his heel. A gunshot sounded far away. Mara turned instantly. A second shot followed. The echo came from the direction Harker had taken the child. Mara ran before Mercer could catch her arm. He shouted, but she was already between the trees. Mercer and Reed ran after her. They found Harker beyond a low stand of trees. The doctor held the baby and stood with his back against a large trunk. He had not been shot. The 2 rounds had been warnings from the men blocking his path. Vale stood in an open patch with 4 armed men. Warren appeared farther left, having returned when he heard the shots. Mercer stepped forward and ordered Vale out of the area. Vale looked at Harker, then at the baby. "This has gone too far." Vale said the project had originally been created to study the creatures humans called Sasquatch. Early researchers believed that understanding them could lead to restricted logging and protection from uncontrolled hunting. But every piece of evidence attracted wealthy collectors, private institutes, and people who wanted to possess what no one else had. Money changed the mission. Mercer asked why Vale remained if he understood what had happened. Vale said secrecy was still safer than national exposure. If the public believed the creatures existed, thousands would enter the woods with rifles, cameras, rewards, and ambitions. Towns like Willow Creek would become hunting destinations. In Vale's mind, a small organization controlling the secret was less dangerous than the whole world fighting over it. Mercer looked at the steel cage they had already seen. "Is that what you call protection?" Vale did not answer. He demanded the child. Mercer asked why an infant mattered enough to justify kidnapping a doctor and erasing police records. Vale looked at the baby. An adult could be dismissed as a bear, a person with deformities, or a hoax. A child with records, blood samples, parents, and the ability to grow up inside human society would become evidence more difficult to contain than any footprint. Harker held the baby tighter. Children grow up. A deep sound came from the forest. A huge figure stepped between two trees behind Harker. It was taller than any creature Mercer had seen before. Black-gray hair covered massive shoulders. Its hands hung near its knees. A second appeared on the right. More shapes moved forward and formed a curved line between Vale's men and Harker. They were close enough for Mercer to see breath in the cold air. Mara moved toward the infant. One of the creatures leaned aside and let her pass. Mercer understood the scene in the simplest possible way. The forest people had placed themselves between armed men and a child. He, Harker, Reed, and Warren were standing on the same side of that barrier. Vale told his men to stay calm. The shot exploded. It staggered backward and released a deep roar powerful enough to send birds flying from distant trees. The forest fell into chaos. Mercer saw only fragments. One of Vale's men was knocked aside when a huge arm swept his rifle away. Another Sasquatch tore down a low branch and used it as a barrier. Reed tried to move Warren toward lower ground. Harker carried the baby behind a boulder. The Sasquatch used strength, unlike anything Mercer had witnessed. Yet one thing remained clear. They focused on breaking weapons, pushing people back, and opening escape routes for their own members. A man from Vale's team slammed his shoulder into Mercer's chest. His gun slipped away. As he tried to stand, another shot sounded. Reed stopped suddenly. His hand clamped over the area near his shoulder and ribs. Warren dragged him behind a tree. Mara saw Harker and the child roughly 20 yards away. She ran through the open space. Mara's body jerked. She stopped mid-stride and fell into wet leaves. The baby began crying. Mercer tried to get up, but his boots slid in mud. A massive figure appeared behind Harker. The creature bent down and extended both arms toward the infant. Harker remembered Mara's instruction. He looked at the creature, then slowly offered the baby forward. Two enormous hands received the child with such care that Harker never forgot it. The Sasquatch pressed the infant against its chest, turned, and disappeared between the trees. Two others followed as a protective screen. Vale saw what happened. Mercer crawled toward Mara. She lay on one side, pressing a hand against the wound where the bullet had passed through. Her breathing was weak but steady. He called Harker. The doctor ran over once the area became less chaotic and examined her. Mercer said they would take her to a hospital. Mara caught his sleeve. Her grip was weaker than before, but still strong enough to stop him. She looked toward the direction where the baby had disappeared. When the crying faded safely into the forest, her expression softened. "The hospital makes records. I can protect the records." Mara looked at him like someone who had already learned the limits of that promise. In 2 days, photographs had vanished. The duty book had been taken. Hair samples had been stolen. A doctor had been kidnapped. Men with false documents had walked into the sheriff's office. "What do I do?" Mara took a painful breath. "If you want them to stop searching, give them what they need most. A story easier to believe than the truth. A report containing no Mara Voss, no woman in cell 2, no infant, no custody record." Mercer finally understood what Mara had been leading him toward from the first night. He once believed that putting a person into the system created protection. Now the same record had become a thread hunters could follow. Mara tightened her hand on his sleeve one last time. "If you want them to forget this, let them believe I never existed." Warren was bandaging Reed. Harker still watched the route where the child had been carried away. Vale and the remaining men had withdrawn. But Mercer knew the conflict was not finished. For the first time in his career, he began preparing to make a decision opposite to everything he had been taught. He would erase an arrest to protect the woman he had once placed in a cell. After the fight, he, Harker, and Warren moved her to an old logging cabin far from the main road. Reed's wound was treated separately, so too many people would not appear at one location. With limited equipment, Harker removed the blood-soaked cloth around Mara's injury and checked the bullet path. The round had passed through rather than remaining inside. That improved her chances, but blood loss had weakened her badly. The infant had disappeared with the Sasquatch group. None of them knew exactly where it was, yet Mara seemed calmer about that than anyone else. When Harker asked if the child was safe, she said only, "It is with people who know why it must be protected." The next morning, Mercer returned alone to Willow Creek. Two unfamiliar vehicles stood near the sheriff's office. Inside, two neatly dressed men waited with briefcases. They introduced themselves only as representatives assigned to clarify the previous day's incident. One placed a typed report before Mercer. The report said police had received a call about a possible transient on a logging road, but severe weather prevented positive identification. No infant had entered the station. Reed's injury was described as an accident during a search on wet terrain. There had been a call, but no one was found. Reed was hurt, but in an accident. The station lost power, but because of weather. Mercer asked who authorized it. The answer remained vague. Reed was brought in later with his arm firmly bandaged. He read the report and looked at Mercer. Both understood that signing meant personally denying something they knew had happened. He hesitated longest. He was younger and still believed telling the exact truth should naturally be the correct choice. Reed signed next. Warren finally signed. 3 signatures turned an unforgettable night into an almost empty administrative incident. He kept a small notebook at home, rather than in the sheriff's office. After each event, he wrote times, names, locations, and sentences he remembered. He recorded Delaney's call, Cell 2, Samuel Harker, Edwin Vale, and Mara Voss. He redrew the symbol from the concrete, described the footprint beneath the window, and copied the words, "Voss line confirmed," from the Polaroid. At first, Mercer had written these notes simply to impose order on events that felt impossible. Now they became the only record he trusted not to be altered. A week later, he checked every official place where traces of Mara's detention might remain. The duty book had been replaced. There was no intake sheet, no medical record connected to Mara Voss. Warren's photographs were gone. Part of the Cell 2 floor had been resurfaced under the explanation that old concrete had cracked. Mara's symbol could no longer be seen. Mercer still possessed one object the cleanup missed. The strip of bark with Trust on one side and Reed on the other remained in his coat pocket. He placed it in a small wooden box with the notebook and a letter he did not yet know who would someday read. Rain gave way to colder weather, and Willow Creek returned to normal conversation: timber, gasoline prices, roads, and late hunting season. Rumors about a strange figure on a forest road survived only briefly. Delaney continued saying he had seen an enormous woman carrying a child in the rain, then gradually stopped because people laughed whenever he repeated it. A large truth did not always need to be officially forbidden. Sometimes it only needed to become a story that embarrassed the person telling it. One afternoon, Mercer was driving the eastern route when he noticed the 3-line symbol freshly carved into a tree. His pistol stayed holstered. Another symbol led across a small creek and onto higher ground where the forest thinned. Mara stood there. Her injury had slowed her. Hair along one side had been cut where Harker treated the wound, and a cleaner bandage covered the area. The infant was in her arms. Mercer stopped several yards away. Relief came before any question. He had wondered whether Mara survived after the confrontation. Now she looked down at the child so Mercer could see that it too was alive and healthier. "Is Vale still looking?" "People like Vale rarely disappear," she said. They changed names, people, and reasons. Her community had already left the locations marked on Vale's map. Old routes would be abandoned for a time. Mercer asked about Helen. Mara looked down. She had never found proof that Helen was dead. Stories from other groups claimed that a woman resembling Helen had been seen far north years after she disappeared, but Mara could not confirm them. Mercer understood that he had no right to fill the uncertainty with guesses. What happens to the child? It will grow where it can learn both ways of living. It would know human language. When old enough, it could decide where it wanted to belong. Mercer looked at Mara and the infant. Then he apologized for arresting her the first night. Mara shook her head. That was what I wanted. If she allowed the sheriff to detain her, she forced a representative of law to look at her long enough to decide how she should be treated. Were you sure I would help? No. Mara only knew that years earlier Mercer had closed a forest route and stopped a group from entering an area where injured forest people were hiding. He had done it because of landslide danger and never knew whom he protected. To the forest community, his reason mattered less than his choice. What side do you think I chose this time? Mercer asked. Mara looked toward the trees, the side of those being hunted. Before leaving, he asked one more question. How many people are there like you? Mara did not answer immediately. She looked into the forest. Only then did Mercer notice they were not alone. Several figures stood farther between the trees. One was taller than Mara and almost completely covered in hair. Mercer counted at least 6. Then another shape appeared. Others, wearing ordinary clothing on a dark street, might pass without anyone thinking they belonged to another hidden community. Don't write their names, Mara said. In his private notebook, he later described the meeting, but omitted the exact location and any route details precise enough to guide another person there. That became the limit he placed on preserving truth. Mara turned away with the child. Occasionally, someone reported a large figure beside a road. Once, a hunter claimed to see an unusually tall woman on a slope beside an even larger creature. Mercer wrote the official reports in ordinary language and kept other details only in his private notebook. Reed left law enforcement before Mercer and almost never discussed the case. Harker continued practicing medicine for years but refused questions involving Bigfoot stories around Willow Creek. Warren moved away while still relatively young. Edwin Vale disappeared from every record Mercer could access. The name Palisade Survey never appeared again in any public file he found. Mercer grew old with the secret. He married, watched his children become adults, became a grandfather, and eventually left police work. His family knew only that he kept old notebooks and disliked anyone touching the wooden box in his study. He considered telling them about Mara many times. Each time he remembered his promise not to turn memory into a road leading strangers into the forest. When Mercer died, the box was moved into the family attic with dozens of possessions no one wanted to throw away, but no one knew what to do with. Nearly 6 decades after the rainy night in 1968, Mercer's grandson Daniel opened it. Daniel was helping clear the old family house before it was sold. He had spent the morning sorting photographs, tax records, and letters. The 1968 notebook lay beneath old newspaper. Daniel recognized his grandfather's handwriting immediately. Several pages later, he saw a name, Mara Voss, female detained, cell 2. Daniel kept reading, a newborn infant, a footprint outside a cell window, Edwin Vale, Voss line. Daniel first wondered whether his grandfather had written fiction in old age. The pages had been written as events occurred. Ink and handwriting changed from day to day. Many sections were structured like work notes rather than a story written years afterward. Daniel began checking. He could find no public record of Mara Voss being detained in Willow Creek in 1968. No matching female prisoner. Mara's name did not appear in local records. At first, the absence seemed to prove the notebook was fiction. Then Daniel found a small newspaper report confirming a power failure in Willow Creek on the exact night Mercer had recorded. The deputy's name was Thomas Reed. Daniel returned to the notebook. He began searching old reports of Bigfoot sightings around Willow Creek after 1968. Most were too vague to matter. Shadows, howls, tracks. Several witnesses described a large figure whose face seemed female. A report in the 1970s mentioned a creature carrying a small child. Another years later described two figures, one massive and another more human in shape. The clearest clue was a photograph from 1971. Far behind them, among the trees, was a tall figure. Daniel enlarged the digital copy. The woman held a child of about 3 years old. Daniel turned over the original print. She came back. It was Elias Mercer's writing. Daniel now knew his grandfather had either met Mara again or had seen her after the detention and knew she survived. Daniel continued following names from the notebook. An old hunter Mercer had once noted as knowing secret forest routes was long dead, but land records showed he had owned a remote cabin. Daniel went there near the end of 2025. The cabin was nearly abandoned. Boards had rotted, the door leaned, and dust covered the interior. Inside were dozens of photographs. They stretched across decades. Some were too blurred to identify. Some contained tall figures at distances difficult to explain away. Then Daniel found Mara. One photograph had no exact year but appeared to be from the late 1960s or early 1970s. Another was marked 1971, then 1984, 1987, 2011, but far more slowly than Daniel expected across so many decades. The final photograph made him sit down in an old chair. The year written on the back was 2025. Hair around her shoulders showed patches of silver. Her face was older than in 1968, but Daniel recognized the structure described throughout Mercer's notes. Behind her stood an enormous Sasquatch. He wore an ordinary jacket, jeans, and hiking boots. On a street, nobody would have a reason to look at him twice. Daniel placed the 1971 photograph beside the 2025 image. He compared the ears, eye spacing, and a small mark near the cheekbone. The middle-aged man in the 2025 picture could be the child Mara carried in 1968. The baby had grown up, and if Daniel's interpretation was correct, it had grown into a man who looked completely human. Daniel finally understood why people like Vale had feared a child more than an 8-foot creature. An adult like Mara could be dismissed as an abnormal human, a legend, or a hoax. At the bottom of the photo trunk was an envelope. Daniel's name was written on it. He recognized his grandfather's handwriting. The letter had been written years before Mercer died. During his final meeting with Mara, he had seen at least 7 people sharing some of her characteristics. Some appeared much closer to Sasquatch. Others appeared much closer to human. Mercer believed the community lines had existed for generations and might be far larger than anything he understood. He wrote that erasing the 1968 arrest originally felt like a betrayal of his profession. But in Mara's case, the same record could become evidence leading hunters directly to her family. At the end of the letter, Mercer wrote, "If one day you read this, don't look for her. If she wants you to find her, she will let you." Daniel read the sentence several times. Daniel replaced the photographs, kept the letter in his hand, and prepared to return to his vehicle. A knocking sound came from the forest. Daniel stopped. The pattern matched descriptions in the notebook. He walked onto the porch. Fresh snow was thin enough that every track showed clearly. Near the tree line began a line of human boot prints. Beside them was a line of enormous bare footprints. The two trails ran parallel. Their spacing was steady. Daniel remembered all the stories about humans being followed by creatures in the forest. A fresh symbol had been cut into a tree near the cabin. Daniel opened Mercer's notebook and found the old drawing. Beneath the symbol was another mark. Daniel did not know whether it meant Mara or something else. He looked deeper into the forest. The distance hid fine detail, but he could see broad shoulders, long hair or body hair, and a face lighter than the surrounding form. Daniel had a camera in his coat pocket. He knew that if he pulled it out, took enough photographs, and brought them back, He might finally possess the evidence his grandfather had never kept publicly. Daniel did not reach for it. The figure turned and disappeared among the trees. A low howl sounded farther away. Daniel looked one final time at the two parallel lines of tracks. At last he understood what had taken Elias Mercer nearly a lifetime to accept. His grandfather had not erased the record because he feared people discovering that he had met a monster. Mara never needed Mercer to decide whether she belonged to humans or Bigfoot. The child never needed anyone to assign a label explaining what it was. They needed the chance to exist without being hunted, because their bodies, ancestry, and family made other people curious. Daniel closed the notebook. He returned to his vehicle without taking a photograph. The other was much larger. They traveled in the same direction and disappeared together among the trees. Some secrets are buried because people fear what may live in darkness. Others are protected by people who finally understand that sometimes the forest does not need protection from monsters. Sometimes the people in the forest need protection from us.